Hello, dear colleagues and friends. My name is Vasilij Meljnikov. I'm a full-time professor at the Ljubljana Music Academy, and it is my pleasure to introduce a great colleague and friend, Matej Haas.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Matej Haas, and I'm an assistant teacher at the Ljubljana Music Academy. Today we are also joined by two students of Professor Meljnikov's class, Vivijana Rogina and Zala Kocijančič, who will play a few musical excerpts and maybe talk a little bit about their experience regarding period instruments. Without further ado, Professor Meljnikov, who is by the way also the mastermind and initiator of today's talk, is going to give a short introduction.
The name of our presentation is Our Teaching Experience in Playing Transitional, Baroque and Modern Violin Bows as a means of interpreting different styles. During the preparation for today's talk, we have come to realize that our message is more extensive and versatile than our title suggests. We could say that our actual title is Our Teaching Experience and Vision of using different kinds of bows in connection with interpreting different styles. Our research of today's topic is inspired and backed up by the work of authors such as Nikolaus Harnoncourt, Bruce Hines, Saul Babbitt, and some others. One of the reasons we are doing our research and are giving this presentation today lies in the fact that we have yet to come across a written source that would systematically outline how historical performance practice and playing period instruments could be incorporated into a studying process at conservatoires and universities. Of course, we are talking about general violin studies and not specialized early music studies. In our opinion, the modern view of history and availability of information in music has resulted in the need for development and change in mentality. As Nikolaus Harnoncourt wrote in 1967, one day we shall have to recognize the fact that the wish to hear all music in unedited form, as close to the original as possible, sets off a chain reaction: tempi, number of performance, acoustics of halls, sound and sound blending of instruments, which cannot be halted, and at the end of which stands a performance corresponding to the circumstances at the time of composition is very respect.
As Harnoncourt suggests, compositions from various time periods are best performed in accordance with the performance practice of the time in which they were composed. In the 21st century, the field of musical education is producing excellent musicians who are well capable of winning competitions and orchestral auditions, whose excellence shows itself in their technical ability. Less attention, however, is devoted to deepening their understanding of various playing styles. And I would like to read an excerpt from Harnoncourt's book, Music as Speech. Professional musicians today are forced to play music from many different periods using the same tools. As any orchestra member knows, he will play contemporary music today, for example, and a symphony by Mozart or a work by Bach or Gustav Mahler tomorrow. They cannot use different instruments every day. This means that they must know the various musical idioms so well that they can play in completely different ways on the same instrument. This is only rarely successful, however. Although we do play the music of 5 centuries, we usually use only one language, one performance style. The curriculum at most universities around the world involves the students simultaneously studying pieces from the Baroque, Classical, Romantic and Modern eras. The students are sort of being taught to play music of different time periods in more or less the same way. That way being the universal modern style, distinguished by long phrases, inaudible bow changes, continuous use of vibrato, and rare use of rubato. This universal style phenomenon is described very well by the American-Canadian author Bruce Haynes in his book The End of Early Music. Haynes talks about the modern style being a descendant of the Romantic style, which started to emerge after the French Revolution in 1789, and lasted up until the early 20th century. During this time, the general approach of how people viewed music changed dramatically. For the first time in history, musicians started to create a repertoire that included works from various time periods and started to view this repertoire as being their own. In other words, the music that originated from previous generations became a part of their own time. Of course, that also meant that the performing style had to be adapted to fit the contemporary public's taste and expectations. We musicians of the 21st century, being descendants of the Romantic era, have kept this tradition. According to Haynes, we are practicing a chronocentric approach. And I will now read a quote from Haynes's book, which talks about chronocentrism. To musicians of the traditional school, there is only one performing style, their own. Fashions and knowledge of fashions do not extend backward beyond a couple of generations to their teacher's teacher. This used to be the way everybody related to the past. Bach's music, it was believed, could be understood on the same aesthetic terms as Beethoven's or Wagner's. Our predecessors tended to think that no problem existed. One simply played the music according to inherited custom, and if in the process we refashioned it, that was our right. This is a chronocentric position, assuming that one's own time or period represents the reference point, the equivalent in time of the spatial concept of chronocentrism. And this brings us back to the essence of today's talk. We would like to encourage the viewers and our students to view their repertoire as a collage of different styles and musical languages that are independent from one another. This approach also fits our idea that we should at the very least get acquainted with period instruments, since this would enable us modern violinists to produce sound nuances and articulation as they were intended by the composers.
Next, we would like to share our experience from the time of our studies regarding this topic. During the time of my studies in Minsk, Soviet Union, I had the privilege to learn violin with the famous violinist and professor Olga Parkhomenko, a student of David Oistrakh. She taught us a lot about the interpretation and understanding of various musical languages. There was also an early music course taught by Elmira Gabrielian, whom we can see in the center of this photo. During our time with her, we used essays by Quantz, Matheson, Arnold, Schering, Schweitzer as our main study material, and we received a lot of information about the agogic, interpretational, and musical effects. Unfortunately, we did not own period instruments or got strings, and we were lacking the practical knowledge of early music. Later in my life, after becoming a university professor, I was happy to deepen my knowledge of Bach's and Mozart violin works with the help of the world-famous Slovenian violinist and pedagogue Igor Ozim.
And Igor Ozim was my violin teacher at the Mozarteum University in Salzburg. In his class, we were taught to play mostly in the modern manner, with various elements of historical performance practice starting to emerge on the surface. We were instructed to play early music from our professor's personal editions, which were the result of a lifetime of gathering knowledge from historical sources and concert experience. Professor Ozim would also lend Baroque bows to students who showed increased interest in early music and explain to us what the differences in the technical executions were. Another important influence on my musical development was the German violinist and conductor Reinhard Goebel, who is also a professor in Salzburg. He taught historical performance practice without compromise, relying heavily on historical sources, analysis, and knowledge of musical history. He would also lead orchestral projects where we would play various orchestral and solistic works.
Since the title of this conference is Formal and Informal Learning, we are also looking to find new ways in which young musician violinists can be educated. Matej?
I would like to read the following quote by Harman Kur. "It is not enough to simply master the technical aspects of music. I believe that only if we succeed in teaching musicians to understand the language of music again, or better yet, the many languages of the many different musical styles, and at the same time educate the listener to appreciate this language, will this apathetic and aestheticizing approach to music no longer be acceptable, nor the monotony of concert programs tolerated. Are these few pieces which are played over and over again from Tokyo to Moscow to Paris really the quintessence of Western music? And as a logical consequence of this, the separation between popular and serious music, and ultimately also between music and time, will disappear, and cultural life will once again form a whole. This should be the objective of musical education in our time. Since the necessary institutions already exist, it should be easy to infiltrate and change their objectives, thereby giving them a new content. What the French Revolution brought about by means of the program of the Conservatoire, which amounted to a radical transformation of musical life, the present age should also be able to achieve, assuming that we are clear about the need for such a transformation.
Let us have a look at what playing period instruments looks like in practice. We have in front of us more bows and 3 violins. I would like to invite my talented and perspective student Zala Kocijančič to play a short excerpt from Bach's Chaconne. She will be playing with a modern bow built by Vladimir Radosavljević.
Next, she is going to play the same piece with a different bow. But before we do that, let us hear what Harman Kur has to say about articulation, since articulation is the most prominent reason as to why we choose to play historical bows in the first place. Quote, "When a musician, ignorant of the speaking, dialogue-like character of Baroque music, reads the articulation signs as if they had been written during the 19th century, his interpretation will paint rather than speak. We all know how a foreign language is learned. By analogy, Baroque music is for us a foreign language, since we obviously do not live in the Baroque period. Therefore, as in the case of a foreign language, we must learn vocabulary, grammar and pronunciation, musical articulation, the theory of harmony, the theory of phrasing and accentuation."
In the picture, you can see a heavier model of a late Baroque bow. The increased weight enables good sound production on modern steel strings and tuning at 443 Hz. We can observe the difference in the shape of the rod when the hair is tightened and released. Zala will share her experience and opinion about playing Johann Sebastian Bach's music using a modern bow compared to a late Baroque bow.
In my experience, changing to a Baroque bow helped me make a realization of an expression I already felt but couldn't directly achieve because of the technical manner that is needed. Practicing with it made it possible for me to also access the right feeling with my modern bow. With achieving that, you can contribute to the variety of expressions and styles, which is, in my opinion, one of the most important components of being an artist. I would like to comment on a page out of Saul Babbitt's essay on the interpretation of the solo sonatas and partitas by Bach. The author shows the difference in bow division when playing on a modern bow versus a Baroque bow that intensifies and produces a different articulation. Now, Professor is going to slowly demonstrate the same passage from the Chaconne once again. Please note the difference in bow division. The difference is not only in the amount of bow that is being used, but also and mainly in the pronunciation, articulation, and agogic. These elements are executed more easily on a Baroque bow, but can also be done on a modern bow, provided the violinist has the required skills to do so.
We would like to show you an interesting recording made in the Museo del Violino in Cremona, where Vivijana plays the beginning of the Chaconne. She is playing on the same late Baroque bow that we saw previously.
Most of our students gain positive experience by playing a slightly heavier Baroque bow on a modern violin. Doing so allows them to gain practical knowledge of the differences between bows and enables them to experiment with articulation, effects, and rhetorical aspects of playing.
Now I will play a period violin with gut strings tuned at 4/15 Hz. For this violin I am going to use a lighter late Baroque bow that Tartini, Pugnani or Geminiani might have used. Like the previous bow that we saw, this one was also built by the bow maker Paolo. In the picture you can see this bow in detail, both in the tense and relaxed state. Now I'd like to play something by Tartini.
I would like to emphasize that in order to be successful in historically informed interpretation, we must not only adapt our playing manner, but also use the appropriate scores. And Tartini's Devastrial Sonata is an example that illustrates this. The romantic arrangement by Fritz Kreisler that we all know and love was made by Kreisler to fit the aesthetic ideals of his time. Articulation and fingering were altered in order to be comfortable to play on a modern violin, much like Joachim's arrangements of Mozart's violin concertos. Therefore, we recommend our students to get acquainted with original, unaltered editions of early works and form their own interpretation based on their best knowledge and also their experience in trying out period instruments.
let's move on to the instrument used in the second half of the 18th century. I would like to ask Vivijana to play an excerpt from Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 3. This time she is using a transitional bow built by the Austrian bow maker Thomas Gerbet. This type of bow was invented by Kramer in the 18th century and would have been used by Mozart and other artists on the classical period. The tuning is for 30 Hz on gut strings. (1750 to 1800) was an era of transitional bows of the various shapes and sizes. A very typical bow that represents this period is the Kramer model that has its roots in Germany and France. The main excellence of this type of bow is its usefulness for playing music of the Galant period, also known as Rococo sometimes, dating approximately from 1750 to 1790. Let us listen to Vivijana play the same except with a Kramer model on a modern violin. Thank you, Vivijana. Bravo. Could you tell us a little bit how it feels to play this bow on your violin?
I find that for a truthful and integrated interpretation of different styles with all of their nuances, it is of vital importance to use a stylistically distinct bow. In my opinion, the majority of violinists' artistry and expression lies in right hand. With exploring the art of the bow, one gets a direct view of the natural articulation that a certain historical bow provides, if we are curious and trusting enough to let it lead us. Developing the sensibility is important and help us enrich our interpretational technique.
It is important to stress that with today's presentation, we are not trying to claim that period instruments are in any way better than modern instruments or vice versa. We are simply illustrating the benefits that a modern violin student can have from being introduced to period instruments and performance practice. In regards to this topic, I would like to read the next passage. When we talk about how music sounded in various periods, we usually focus on the sounds of the instruments. So the phrase "old instruments" begins to function as a value judgment with all its related drawbacks and advantages. Only 5 years ago, one might have heard, "It is amazing how lovely that sounds, even on those old instruments." But one is now more likely to hear, "This is very lovely, despite the fact that old instruments were not used." Standards have changed this markedly in such a few years. It is not at all clear if instruments really are the critical factor in the discussion of sound conditions. I am of the opinion that musical diction and articulation, and the whole question of intonation in music of the 17th and 18th centuries, are far more important to sound than are the instruments, because they affect musical substance much more directly. The other approach, often taken today, leads us astray, in my opinion. There are many musicians who believe that early music must be played on authentic instruments, but they do not have a precise notion of what these old instruments can and cannot do. They acquire an old instrument without understanding its meaning, only because they have been hired to play an old instrument and the gig plays well, or because they themselves find it interesting. The decisive element in their decision, the benchmark as it were, is the old instrument, the original instrument, not what this old instrument can do.
Let us talk about a violin bow model from the end of the 18th century, named the Tourte model. I would like to show you a Tourte model bow originating from the German bow maker family of Christian Knopf. The bow is approximately 170 years old and very much resembles a modern bow. And here I have another modern violin bow in Tour style made by the Viennese bow maker Thomas Gerbet. Whenever we talk about the French bow maker François-Xavier Tourte, we must mention his connection with the great violinist and composer Giovanni Battista Viotti, whom we can see in the picture.
I would like to read how Bernard Godefroy describes Viotti in his book History of Bow in France during the 18th century. Giovanni Battista Viotti, the best student of Gaetano Pugnani, in 1782 traveled from Torino to Paris, the violin capital of the time, asked several luthiers to try out various modifications in order to improve the bow, both in regards to the form and the material. That was when Pernambuco wood became the definitive choice for valuable bows. What was the result of Viotti's collaboration with the bow maker François Tourte? Antoine Vidal, a 19th century French critic, writes, Tourte was generally helped in his research by the great violinists of the day. Viotti, among others, advised him and thus contributed to the development. As for Laurent Grillet, he states that in principle Viotti lightened the tip of the bow while preserving its strength, adjusted the curve and established the distance between the stick and the bow hair. He also designed the metallic ring, adapted the heel and determined the length of the bow. After numerous trials, he adopted Pernambuco wood exclusively and perfected the equilibrium of the bow. The bow has almost the same strength at the tip and at the frog, which seems to be a considerable advantage. It was the Viotti-Tourte bow that enabled the rise of the modern model, yet none of the bows used at the turn of the 19th century could claim universality. Viotti will always be known for his phrase, "Le violon, c'est l'archet," meaning the violin is the bow. Let us listen to Professor Meljnikov playing the beginning of Viotti's 22nd violin concerto. The violin has gut strings tuned at 430 Hz. The bow is a flute model from the beginning of the 19th century. We can hear that this bow produces a singing-like sound, which is formed evenly throughout the entire length of the bow.
The violin and the bow have changed very little in the last 200 years. The second half of the 19th century brought with it the Industrial Revolution and mass production of musical instruments in France, Germany, in Austro-Hungarian Empire. Concert halls were getting bigger, orchestras were increasing in size, other instruments such as the fortepiano, wind and brass instruments were also going through a transformation. The bow makers that worked in the 19th century mainly built violin bows with a slightly different curve and a little less flexible rod. As large concert halls were becoming a standard in the world of music, there was also a need for stronger, more brilliant sounding bows. Steel strings were gaining in popularity, so the weight of the bows increased accordingly from 54 grams in the early 19th century to about 62 or even 65 grams at the end of the century. On screen, you can see a picture of the French master Tourt as Matej reads the next quote but Arnoncourt.
The bow created by Tourt at the end of the 18th century produced an equally strong tone along its entire length. Further, an almost inaudible bow change can be executed almost completely, masking the difference between up bow and down bow. In addition, the violinist can play extremely loudly with this bow, while the bouncing bow technique sounds hard and drum-like. These qualities, which make it ideal for rendering the broad sound surfaces of music after 1800, must be paid for by the loss of many other qualities. With such a bow, it is very difficult to create an elastic, bell-shaped tone, to shorten a tone so that it does not sound chopped off, or to give a different sound quality to the up and the down bow, something required in early music and easy to execute with the Baroque bow. Of course, a violinist may say that this is precisely what is wrong, that one should make up and down bows as similar as possible, that the modern Tourt bow is better than the old Baroque bow because it alone can produce an even sound. But when we proceed from the premise that music can be best performed when it is properly interpreted, we discover that all the apparent disadvantages of the Baroque bow are actually advantages. The tones that are usually paired sound different on the up bow and down bow. The individual tone has a bell-like dynamic. Innumerable intermediate levels from legato to spiccato play themselves, as it were. We see that the Baroque bow is ideal for Baroque music, so there are good reasons for using it. This does not mean that it is the perfect bow, however. We will not play Richard Strauss with it, but strangely enough, this is precisely what was done, only the other way around with the Tourt bow. We are slowly moving towards the end of our presentation. So far, we have discussed formal elements of violin playing, such as instruments, repertoire, and performance practice. This last part is going to be about the link that brings all those elements together. Just like a cooking recipe does not guarantee a delicious meal, a well-written piece of music and the best instruments in the world also don't necessarily produce a fantastic concert. And I'm going to read a passage by Bruce Haynes where I borrowed the cooking metaphor. As Christopher Small and other musical thinkers have pointed out, music is not a thing. It is an act, something people do. We normally like to think of the work as the written object because it has a fixed, stable form. We talk about music on the stand, but the notes on the page aren't a work. In fact, they aren't music at all. They are merely a recipe for performers to follow, a cookbook. It's like trying to eat a cookbook. There is a missing step in between. Theoreticians of various kinds like to argue this point, but to people who actually music, who listen or perform, it is self-evident that a work takes on its definition in performance. Musical meaning doesn't exist until the moment of reception, the moment a piece is performed and heard. Next, we would like to play a video recording of Vivijana playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto on a modern violin using a Tourt model bow. Inspired by Vivijana's video, I would like to briefly mention that everything that we talked about today will not be sufficient on its own to create a convincing performance. While we believe it is absolutely essential for any musician to have strong theoretical knowledge, good instruments, and brilliant playing technique, there is a key element that supersedes all of them. Some may call it musicality, others inspiration or creativity. Harnon Kur calls it the kiss of the muse, and I will read what he has to say. Quote, I regard any musician completely unsuited for proper interpretation who, while doing everything perfectly in a technical sense, observing all aspects of articulation, paying close attention to the sources, using the correct instrument, intoning in mean tone, choosing the correct tempo, lacks one thing: musicality, or to put it more poetically, the kiss of the muse. It is a terrible truth in this profession, but if a person has not been kissed by the muse, he can never be a musician.
I would like to summarize the content of our talk. In the promo video that we uploaded on the homepage of the conference, we mentioned 3 bows of various styles in one violin case. This is just an instant derivative of our general view upon multi-style playing and understanding different playing manners. The essence of our approach is to offer students multi-layered knowledge, combining several period instruments, various tunings, and to deepen their understanding of musical languages. By doing this, we encourage young musicians to have a broad, exploratory approach towards early music.
At this point, we are almost done with our video. We would like to leave you with a few final words by Bruce Haynes that we find especially meaningful. In striving for authenticity, we are creating something of our own, modern through and through, and something impossible to achieve incidentally by continuing to use received tradition. With time, authenticity has found its most useful role as a paradigm, an ideal and an inspiration that may or may not actually exist. It is not the realization of authenticity that is important to us as musicians. It is rather the pursuit of it. Harry Haskell's suggestion that authenticity, like perfection or happiness, is best conceived as an ideal to be pursued rather than as a goal to be attained.
Thanks for watching, have a lovely day, and we are looking forward to your questions and feedback. And of course, thank you very much. Matej, thank you, and goodbye.
Bye.